Please, Brandon, not here. People can see us. Melody Richardson pressed her hand against her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant and exhausted from the pharmaceutical company picnic that had dragged on for hours in the summer heat. The familiar knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach as she pushed through the glass door of Richardson Family Pharmacy, the bell chiming overhead like a warning. The small-town pharmacy in Millbrook had been her sanctuary since childhood. Uncle Bill had owned it for 20 years, and the familiar smell of antiseptic and vanilla candles usually brought comfort. Today it felt like walking into a trap. Brandon Hartwell stormed in behind her, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face flushed with rage. At 34, her husband commanded respect in boardrooms across the state as CEO of Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, but right now he looked like a petulant child denied his favorite toy. "You embarrassed me," he hissed, grabbing her elbow as she reached for her prenatal vitamins from behind the counter. "Do you have any idea how that looked? My own wife complaining about morning sickness to my investors like some weak, pathetic—" "I was just making conversation," Melody whispered, glancing toward the back office where she hoped Uncle Bill might be doing paperwork. He wasn't supposed to be in until later, but sometimes he came early to avoid the afternoon rush. "Mrs. Patterson asked how I was feeling, so I—" "You made me look weak!" Brandon's voice rose, and Melody instinctively stepped back. 3 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the warning signs: the tight jaw, the clenched fists, the way his voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that preceded the worst moments. She learned to read him like a weather system, tracking the storms that rolled across his features. Today's humiliation at the company picnic, where she'd simply mentioned feeling tired to a board member's wife, had been building pressure all afternoon. "Brandon, please." She tried to keep her voice steady, one hand protectively covering her belly. "The baby can hear when you yell. Don't you dare use that baby to manipulate me." He stepped closer, backing her against the pharmacy counter. "You think because you're pregnant, you can say whatever you want? Disrespect me in public?" The familiar fear crept up her spine. This was how it always started: her supposed disrespect, his wounded pride, her desperate attempts to de-escalate. She'd become an expert at managing his moods, walking on eggshells, making herself smaller and smaller until she barely existed outside his shadow. "I'm sorry," she said automatically, the words bitter on her tongue. "I didn't mean to." "You never mean to, do you?" He grabbed her arm, fingers digging into the tender flesh above her elbow. "But somehow you always manage to find ways to humiliate me." The bruises from last week's incident were still fading, hidden beneath her long-sleeved blouse despite the July heat. She'd gotten good at concealing the evidence, layering foundation over finger-shaped marks, choosing clothes that covered the places where his anger left its signature. "Let go of me," she said quietly, trying to pull away. The baby shifted inside her, as if sensing the tension. Instead of releasing her, Brandon's grip tightened. His other hand came up fast, connecting with her cheek in a sharp crack that echoed through the empty pharmacy. The force of it sent her stumbling sideways, nearly losing her balance. Her hand flew to her stinging face as tears sprang to her eyes. "Maybe next time you'll think before you open your mouth," he said coldly. That's when she heard the voice from behind them, deep and authoritative and absolutely furious. "Get your hands off my niece." Melody's heart lurched as Senator William Richardson stepped out from the back office. His silver hair perfectly styled despite being 68 years old, his blue eyes blazing with an anger she'd rarely seen. Uncle Bill had always been her protector, the father figure who'd stepped in when her own dad struggled with alcohol, but she'd never seen him look so dangerous. Brandon's hand dropped from her arm as if she'd caught fire. The transformation was instant, the rage melting into practiced charm, the businessman's smile sliding into place like a mask. "Senator Richardson," Brandon said smoothly, extending his hand as if nothing had happened. "I didn't realize you were here. Melody and I were just having a small disagreement about—" "I saw exactly what you were doing," Bill said, ignoring the offered handshake and moving to Melody's side. His weathered hands were gentle as he turned her face to examine the red mark blooming across her cheek. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" The endearment broke something inside her chest. When was the last time someone had called her sweetheart? When had Brandon stopped using gentle names and started treating her like a business problem to be managed? I'm fine, she lied automatically, but her voice cracked on the words. No, you're not. Bill's voice was steady, but she could feel the tremor of rage underneath. He'd been a small-town pharmacist before entering politics, had seen his share of domestic violence cases, knew how to recognize the signs. Brandon, I think you should leave. Now wait just a minute. Brandon's mask slipped slightly, revealing the calculating mind beneath. I know how this must look, Senator, but you're misunderstanding the situation. Pregnancy hormones make women emotional, and Melody has been under a lot of stress with the baby coming. Don't! Bill's voice cut through Brandon's explanation like a blade. Don't you dare stand in my pharmacy and gaslight my niece after I watched you hit her. The word hung in the air between them. Hit. Such a small word for something that felt so much larger, so much more devastating. Melody had never let herself use that word before, had always found softer phrases. He'd gotten upset, he'd lost his temper, they'd had a fight. But Uncle Bill called it what it was. Senator, please, Brandon tried again, his political instincts kicking in. I understand you're concerned, but this is a private family matter. Surely a man in your position understands the importance of discretion. Bill's laugh was harsh. Are you threatening me, son? Of course not. Brandon's smile turned razor sharp. I'm simply reminding you that we're all public figures here. Stories have a way of getting twisted when they reach the media. Your niece wouldn't want to be the center of that kind of attention, would you, Melody? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Brandon had connections throughout the state, advertisers who could pressure newspapers, business relationships that could destroy political careers. He'd reminded her of his power countless times during their marriage, how easy it would be to ruin anyone who crossed him. But Uncle Bill just smiled, and for the first time in months, Melody felt a flicker of hope. Brandon, he said conversationally, pulling out his cell phone, I want you to listen very carefully. I've been in politics for 15 years. I've seen men like you come and go. Rich, powerful, convinced they're untouchable. But there's one thing you're forgetting. What's that? Brandon's confidence was starting to crack. I don't give a damn about your money or your threats. That's my niece you just assaulted, and I will burn down everything you think makes you powerful before I let you hurt her again. Bill was already dialing, his thumb moving across the screen with practiced ease. Patricia, it's Bill Richardson. I need you at the pharmacy immediately. We have a domestic violence situation that needs medical documentation. Brandon's face went white. You can't be serious. Dr. Patricia Clearwater, Bill explained to Melody, though his eyes never left Brandon's face. She's been the town doctor for 20 years, and she's a mandatory reporter. Once she documents your injuries, this becomes an official matter. Uncle Bill, no, Melody whispered, panic rising in her throat. You don't understand. If this gets out, if there are legal proceedings, then we'll deal with it, Bill said firmly, together, like families should. Brandon was backing toward the door now, his composure finally cracking completely. This is a mistake, Senator, a huge mistake. I have lawyers, connections, resources you can't imagine. I will destroy you for this. You're welcome to try, Bill replied calmly. But first, you're going to leave my pharmacy and stay away from my niece. She's my wife. She's a human being, Bill shot back, and she deserves better than a man who uses his fist to win arguments. For a moment, Brandon looked like he might rush forward, might try to grab Melody again. But the sound of a car door slamming outside made him hesitate. Through the front window, they could see Dr. Clearwater hurrying toward the entrance, her medical bag in hand. Brandon's last look at Melody was pure poison. This isn't over, he said quietly. Not even close. Then he was gone, the pharmacy door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Melody sank into the chair beside the prescription counter, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her shaky and nauseous. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her emotional turmoil. What have we done? She whispered. Uncle Bill knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. We've stopped pretending this is normal, sweetheart. We've stopped letting him get away with hurting you. But you don't understand, she said desperately. He controls everything. Our bank accounts, the house, my car. If he gets angry enough, then we'll figure it out, Bill said firmly. You're not alone in this anymore. Dr. Clearwater pushed through the door, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, her kind eyes immediately focusing on Melody's face. She'd delivered Melody 29 years ago, had been the family doctor through countless childhood illnesses and injuries. "Oh, honey," she said softly, setting down her medical bag. "Let's take a look at you." As gentle hands examined her cheek, documented the swelling and redness, Melody felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. For 3 years, she'd kept Brandon's anger private, had convinced herself that she could manage it, that things would get better after the baby came. But there was no going back now. Uncle Bill had seen everything, and Dr. Clearwater was already taking photographs, making notes in her careful handwriting. Soon there would be official reports, legal documents, court proceedings. The secret was out, and Melody had no idea what came next. All she knew was that for the first time in 3 years, someone else was willing to stand between her and Brandon's fury. Someone else was willing to fight, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. "Senator, I can explain. This isn't what it looks like." Brandon had returned within 10 minutes, his expensive suit jacket straightened and his politician's smile firmly in place. He'd clearly spent the time in his car making phone calls, probably to his lawyer and his mother, definitely calculating his next move. Dr. Patricia Clearwater didn't even look up from her examination of Melody's cheek. At 45, she'd seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize a perpetrator's damage control when she heard it. "Mr. Hartwell," she said coolly, "I'm going to need you to step back while I complete my medical assessment." "Of course, doctor, I completely understand." Brandon's voice dripped with false concern. "I'm just worried about my wife and our unborn child. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding." Bill Richardson stood up slowly from where he'd been kneeling beside Melody's chair. At 58, he'd maintained the strong build of a man who'd worked with his hands before entering politics. And right now he looked like he was considering putting those hands to use. "The only misunderstanding," Bill said quietly, "is your belief that anyone in this room is stupid enough to believe your act." Brandon's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Senator, I know you're upset. Family loyalty is admirable, but perhaps we should discuss this privately, without getting the good doctor involved in what amounts to a personal family matter. It became my involvement the moment you assaulted someone in front of me," Dr. Clearwater said, finally looking up from her examination. She'd been documenting everything, the handprint-shaped redness on Melody's cheek, the way she flinched when touched, the protective way she held her pregnant belly. "I never assaulted anyone," Brandon said smoothly. "Melody and I had a disagreement. Voices were raised, but I would never hurt my pregnant wife. I watched you backhand her," Bill said flatly. "You saw what you wanted to see," Brandon replied, his political training evident in how quickly he pivoted. "An older man, protective of his niece, misinterpreting a gesture. Stop." Melody's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through Brandon's manipulation like a knife. "Just stop lying." Everyone in the room went silent. Dr. Clearwater's hands stilled on her patient. Bill's jaw tightened, and Brandon's mask finally began to slip. "Melody," Brandon said, his voice taking on that dangerous edge she knew so well, "you're emotional right now. The pregnancy hormones." "I'm tired," Melody said, louder this time. "I'm so tired of pretending this is normal." She looked up at her uncle, tears streaming down her face. "He hits me, Uncle Bill. Not just today. He's been hitting me for months." The words hung in the air like a confession, like a prayer, like a cry for help that had been building in her chest for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Brandon went very still. "Melody, you need to think very carefully about what you're saying." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hartwell?" Dr. Clearwater asked sharply. "It's a reminder," Brandon said, his composure cracking further. "My wife is 8 months pregnant. She's under enormous stress. Sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're being abused by their husbands," Bill finished. Brandon whirled on him. "You have no idea what you're interfering with here, old man. I have more lawyers than you have constituents. I have business relationships that could end your political career with a phone call. One word from me, and every pharmaceutical company in the state stops donating to your campaigns." "There it is," Bill said with grim satisfaction. "The real Brandon Hartwell. Not the charming CEO, not the concerned husband, just another bully who thinks money makes him untouchable. Dr. Clearwater was taking notes again, documenting every word of the exchange. As a mandatory reporter, she was required by law to report suspected abuse, but she also knew the value of thorough documentation. "Melody," she said gently, "I need to ask you some questions. When you're ready." Melody nodded, wiping her eyes. The relief of finally telling someone was overwhelming, but so was the terror of what would come next. Brandon wasn't bluffing about his power. He really could destroy careers, end relationships, make life impossible for anyone who crossed him. But as she looked at her uncle's determined face, at Dr. Clearwater's kind but professional demeanor, she realized she wasn't facing this alone anymore. "When did the physical abuse start?" Dr. Clearwater asked. "6 months ago," Melody said quietly. "Right after we found out I was pregnant." Brandon made a sound of protest, but Bill held up a warning hand. "He started getting angry about everything," Melody continued. "Said I was using the pregnancy to manipulate him, to get out of social obligations. The first time he hit me, he said it was my fault for making him lose control." "Classic abuser language," Dr. Clearwater murmured, still writing. "I convinced myself it was just stress," Melody went on. "He was under so much pressure at work, and I thought if I could just be more careful, not upset him." "It's not your fault," Bill said firmly. "None of this is your fault." Brandon finally exploded. "This is ridiculous. I work 60-hour weeks to provide for my family. I give her everything she could possibly want. If I occasionally lose my temper—" "You don't lose your temper," Melody said, finding her voice again. "You choose to hurt me. There's a difference." "How dare you?" "How dare I what?" Melody stood up slowly, one hand on her back for support. "Tell the truth. Stop covering for you. Stop pretending that your anger is my responsibility." For the first time since she'd known him, Brandon looked genuinely shaken. He was used to her compliance, her desperate attempts to placate him. This new Melody, the one with witnesses and support, was unfamiliar territory. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he said quietly. "No," Melody replied. "The biggest mistake of my life was believing you when you said you loved me." Dr. Clearwater cleared her throat. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to need you to leave so I can complete my examination in private." "She's my wife. She's my patient," Dr. Clearwater said firmly. "And medical privacy laws supersede marital rights." Brandon looked around the room, calculating. Bill stood between him and Melody, protective and immovable. Dr. Clearwater had already documented enough evidence to start legal proceedings. His carefully controlled world was spinning out of his grasp. "This isn't over," he said finally. "I have rights. Parental rights, marital rights. You can't keep me from my child." "We'll see about that," Bill said. Brandon's phone rang, and he answered it with visible irritation. "What? Now? How did they—" His face went pale as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "Mr. Hartwell," he said when he hung up, "Channel 7 News. Can you comment on allegations of domestic violence involving your wife?" The blood drained from Brandon's face. "How did they—" "Small towns," Bill said mildly. "People talk, especially when they hear shouting coming from the local pharmacy." Brandon stared at him with pure hatred. "You called them." "I didn't need to," Bill replied, "but I'm about to." Brandon looked at Melody one last time, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked out of the pharmacy without another word. Dr. Clearwater waited until his car pulled away before turning back to Melody. "Let's continue our examination, shall we?" As gentle hands checked for other injuries, as quiet questions uncovered the full scope of Brandon's abuse, Melody felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was terrifying and fragile, and might not survive what was coming next. But for the first time since her wedding day, she wasn't facing the future alone. Uncle Bill stayed beside her chair, holding her hand while Dr. Clearwater worked. "We're going to get through this," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes, we're going to get you and that baby somewhere safe." Melody squeezed his hand, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, escape was possible. Outside, another news van was pulling into the pharmacy parking lot. The story was just beginning. As a mandatory reporter, I have no choice but to file this. Dr. Patricia Clearwater set down her pen after finishing her documentation, her expression both compassionate and resolute. She'd been Millbrook's primary physician for 20 years, had delivered half the babies in town, and treated 3 generations of some families. But cases like this still made her chest tight with anger. Melody sat in the examination chair, her blouse carefully rolled up to reveal the finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms, purple and yellow marks that told a story Brandon couldn't charm his way out of. These are defensive wounds, Dr. Clearwater explained gently, photographing each bruise with a medical camera. See how they're positioned? You were trying to protect yourself when someone grabbed you. Senator Bill Richardson stood at the window, watching the growing crowd of news vans in the parking lot. His phone had been buzzing constantly for the past 20 minutes, but he'd ignored every call. How many reporters are out there now? Melody asked nervously. 4 news vans, 2 print journalists, and what looks like someone from Channel 12's investigative team, Bill replied grimly. Word travels fast when a senator's niece is involved in a domestic violence case. Dr. Clearwater continued her examination, documenting older injuries with professional thoroughness. Melody, these bruises on your ribs, they're older, maybe 2 weeks. Can you tell me what happened? Melody's voice was barely audible. He was angry about a credit card bill, said I was spending too much on baby clothes. And this mark on your shoulder? Last month, I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning. Each revelation hit Bill like a physical blow. He'd known something was wrong, had noticed how quiet Melody had become over the past year, how she'd stopped visiting family gatherings, how she always seemed nervous when Brandon was around. But he'd told himself it was just the stress of a new marriage and pregnancy. I should have seen it sooner, he said quietly. Abusers are skilled at hiding their behavior, Dr. Clearwater said without looking up from her notes. They isolate their victims, control their social interactions, make everyone else see only what they want them to see. She turned to address Melody directly. I need you to understand what happens next. As a medical professional, I'm required by law to report suspected domestic violence to local authorities. Deputy Morrison will need to take your statement, and the district attorney will decide whether to press charges. What if I don't want to press charges? Melody asked desperately. That's not entirely your choice anymore, Dr. Clearwater explained gently. With photographic evidence and witness testimony, the state can prosecute even without your cooperation. They rarely do in domestic violence cases, but they can. The pharmacy door chimed and Deputy Jake Morrison entered, removing his hat as he surveyed the scene. At 41, he'd been Millbrook's senior law enforcement officer for 8 years and had worked closely with Bill on various community initiatives. Senator, he nodded to Bill, then turned to Melody with professional courtesy. Ma'am, Dr. Clearwater called and said you might need some assistance. Jake, this is my niece, Melody Hartwell, Bill said. She's been assaulted by her husband, and we have medical documentation and eyewitness testimony. Deputy Morrison pulled out a notebook, his expression growing serious. Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you some questions about what happened today. But first, do you feel safe right now? Is there any immediate threat? I don't know, Melody said honestly. Brandon was angry when he left, really angry. And when he gets like that, he escalates, Bill finished. Jake, this man has been systematically abusing my pregnant niece for months. He's powerful, he's connected, and he's not going to accept this quietly. What kind of connected are we talking about? Morrison asked, still writing. CEO of Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, board member of 3 major hospitals, golf partners with half the state legislature, Bill rattled off. He's already threatened my political career, and that was before the news vans showed up. Morrison glanced out the window at the growing media presence. Jesus, this is going to be a circus. That's exactly what Brandon is counting on, Bill said. He thinks we'll back down to avoid the publicity. Will you? Morrison asked bluntly. Bill looked at his niece, at the bruises on her arms, the fear in her eyes, the way she instinctively protected her pregnant belly, and felt something harden inside his chest. Not a chance, he said. Dr. Clearwater handed Morrison a thick folder of documentation. Complete medical report, including photographs of both fresh and healing injuries. Pattern consistent with ongoing physical abuse. Mrs. Hartwell, Morrison said gently, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me exactly what happened today, in your own words. Melody took a shaky breath and began to speak. She told them about the company picnic, about Brandon's anger over her casual mention of morning sickness, about the confrontation in the pharmacy. Her voice grew steadier as she went on, as if speaking the truth aloud was giving her strength. He grabbed my arm and hit me across the face, she said clearly. Uncle Bill saw everything. And this isn't the first time your husband has struck you? No, the word came out as a whisper. It's been happening for months. Morrison nodded, making notes. I'm going to recommend that you apply for an emergency protective order. It'll legally require your husband to stay away from you and maintain no contact. He'll violate it, Melody said with certainty. He doesn't believe rules apply to him. Then he'll be arrested, Morrison said simply. You don't understand. Melody shook her head. He has lawyers, influence. He'll find a way around it. Maybe, Morrison acknowledged, but it's still the first step in building a legal case against him. Dr. Clearwater was cleaning up her examination supplies when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. I have 3 calls from Grace Hartwell, she said, Brandon's mother. Don't answer, Bill said immediately. That woman will try to convince you this is all a misunderstanding. I've met Grace Hartwell, Dr. Clearwater replied dryly. She once tried to convince me that her son's broken arm was caused by vigorous play rather than his father throwing him down the stairs. The revelation hung in the air like a dark cloud. Melody stared at the doctor in shock. Brandon was abused as a child? I can't discuss another patient's medical history, Dr. Clearwater said carefully, but I will say that cycles of violence tend to repeat themselves across generations. Melody felt sick. She'd known Brandon had a difficult relationship with his father, but he'd never mentioned any physical abuse. Had she married a man who was destined to repeat his father's mistakes? Was their unborn daughter already caught in that cycle? It doesn't excuse what he's done to you, Bill said firmly, reading the conflict on her face. His childhood doesn't give him the right to hurt you. I know, Melody said quietly, but it explains some things. Morrison finished his initial report and looked up from his notebook. Mrs. Hartwell, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Family? Friends? She can stay with me, Bill said immediately. I have security, and Brandon knows better than to try anything at a senator's house. What about clothes, personal items? Morrison asked. Everything's at the house, Melody said, but I can't go back there, not yet. We'll arrange for an escort to retrieve your belongings, Morrison promised, but first, let's get that protective order filed. Dr. Clearwater handed Melody a business card. Rebecca Martinez is a counselor who specializes in domestic violence cases. She's helped several women in town transition out of abusive relationships. I don't need counseling, Melody said automatically. Everyone needs counseling after trauma like this, Dr. Clearwater said gently. And Rebecca can help you understand your legal options, connect you with resources, help you plan for life after this. Life after this. The phrase felt surreal. For 3 years, her life had revolved around managing Brandon's moods, avoiding his anger, keeping the peace at any cost. The idea that there might be a life beyond that, a life where she didn't have to walk on eggshells, seemed impossible. But as she looked around the pharmacy, at the 3 adults who had rallied to her defense without hesitation, she began to think that maybe impossible wasn't the same thing as untrue. Morrison's radio crackled to life. Deputy Morrison, we have a situation at the Hartwell residence. Suspect is destroying property and making threats. Morrison keyed his radio. On my way. Mrs. Hartwell, it sounds like your husband is having some kind of breakdown at home. You definitely can't go back there tonight. What kind of threats? Bill asked sharply. Against Mrs. Hartwell and anyone helping her, came the tinny voice through the radio. Neighbors called it in when they heard him screaming about burning down half the town. Melody went white. He's lost control completely. Then we'll make sure you're somewhere he can't find you, Bill said firmly. As Morrison headed for the door, his radio crackled again. Deputy, we've also got Brandon Hartwell's attorney on line too. He's demanding we cease and desist any investigation into his client. Morrison smiled grimly. Tell the lawyer his client is currently destroying evidence and making terrorist threats. We'll investigate whatever we damn well please. After Morrison left, The pharmacy fell quiet except for the hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of reporters setting up outside. "What happens now?" Melody asked. Dr. Clearwater packed the last of her supplies. "Now you heal, physically and emotionally. It's going to be a long process, but you've already taken the hardest step, which is telling the truth," Dr. Clearwater said simply. "Everything else builds from there." As they prepared to leave through the pharmacy's back exit to avoid the media circus out front, Melody caught sight of herself in the security monitor. She looked different somehow, not just because of the visible bruise on her cheek, but because of something in her posture, her expression. For the first time in 3 years, she looked like a woman who expected to be believed. It was a start. "Mr. Hartwell, Channel 7 News. Can you comment on allegations of domestic violence?" Brandon froze halfway to his Porsche, his hand on the driver's side door. The reporter was young, ambitious-looking, with the kind of sharp suit and perfect teeth that suggested she'd clawed her way up from a smaller market and wasn't about to let a story like this slip away. "I have no comment," he said curtly, sliding into his car. But the reporter wasn't deterred. She followed him to his window, microphone extended. "Sir, we have reports that Senator Richardson witnessed you striking your pregnant wife. Can you confirm or deny?" Brandon slammed the car door and started the engine, backing out fast enough that the reporter had to jump out of the way. But as he pulled onto Main Street, he could see 3 more news vans arriving at the pharmacy. His phone rang immediately. "Mother." "Brandon, what in God's name is happening?" Grace Hartwell's voice was sharp with panic. "I just got a call from Patricia Clearwater about some kind of incident, and now Martha Henderson says there are news trucks at Richardson's pharmacy." "It's under control," Brandon said automatically, though his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Under control? There are rumors flying about domestic violence, about police reports. How is any of that under control?" Brandon pulled into the parking lot of his pharmaceutical company, seeking the familiar comfort of the building that bore his family name. Hartwell Pharmaceuticals had been his grandfather's legacy, his father's empire, and now his kingdom. Here, at least, he was still untouchable. "Mother, listen to me carefully," he said, activating the Porsche's Bluetooth. "Melody had some kind of emotional breakdown at the pharmacy. Pregnancy hormones, you know how women get. She started making accusations." "What kind of accusations?" "She claims I hit her, which is ridiculous, of course. But that old fool Richardson saw us having an argument and completely misinterpreted the situation." There was a long pause. Grace Hartwell had spent 40 years as the wife of a powerful man, had learned to read between the lines of carefully worded explanations. "Brandon," she said slowly, "please tell me you didn't actually strike your pregnant wife in public." "I never struck anyone," Brandon said, the lie coming easily. "But Senator Richardson is spinning this into some kind of political theater. He's called the media. He's got that doctor filing reports. Dr. Clearwater is filing medical reports. Mother, you need to help me handle this. Call Patricia, convince her this is all a misunderstanding. Call Judge Stone, she owes our family favors. Call—" "I'll handle Patricia," Grace interrupted. "But Brandon, you need to be very careful here. If this becomes a legal matter—" "It won't," Brandon said firmly. "Melody loves me. She's just confused right now, overwhelmed by the pregnancy. Once she calms down, she'll remember what's at stake." What was at stake was everything. The pharmaceutical company that employed 300 people in Millbrook, the house on Elm Street that had been in his family for 4 generations, the political connections that had taken years to cultivate, the reputation that opened doors throughout the state. Brandon parked and strode into his building, nodding to the security guard who'd worked for his family for 15 years. Here, surrounded by the symbols of his success, the morning's events felt surreal. How could his carefully ordered world be threatened by something as simple as a slap? He'd barely settled behind his mahogany desk when his assistant knocked. "Mr. Hartwell, your attorney is here. He says it's urgent." David Walsh had been the Hartwell family lawyer for 20 years, a sharp-dressed man in his 50s who specialized in making problems disappear quietly and expensively. "Brandon," Walsh said without preamble, "we have a situation." "I'm aware of the situation. That's why I pay you to handle these things." Walsh sat down heavily in the leather chair across from Brandon's desk. This isn't some business dispute we can settle with a check. Your wife has medical documentation of injuries. Senator Richardson is an eyewitness. The media is already calling it a story about domestic violence among the political elite. So we discredit them, Brandon said impatiently. Richardson is a small-town politician looking for attention. Melody is an emotional pregnant woman. Dr. Clearwater is a family friend who can be reasoned with. Have you considered the possibility that you might actually be guilty? Walsh asked bluntly. Brandon's expression went cold. I'm paying you to represent me, not to judge me. I'm trying to keep you out of prison, Walsh shot back. Because if this goes to trial, if they have photographs and witness testimony and a sympathetic victim, Melody won't testify against me, Brandon said confidently. She knows what would happen to her, to the baby, if I go down. Walsh stared at him for a long moment. Are you threatening your own wife? I'm stating facts. Our entire lifestyle depends on my income, my reputation, my business relationships. If I'm destroyed by this, so is she. She's not stupid. She'll figure that out. But even as Brandon said the words, he felt a flicker of uncertainty. The Melody he'd seen in the pharmacy wasn't the compliant woman he'd married. She'd looked at him with something he'd never seen before. Not fear, not submission, but disgust. Walsh's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. Channel 7 wants a statement from you. So does the Tribune, the Herald, and 3 political blogs. Give them the standard response. Family privacy, no comment, blah, blah, blah. Brandon, that's not going to work here. Senator Richardson is already talking to reporters. He's calling this a matter of public safety, saying that powerful men who abuse their wives need to be held accountable, regardless of their political connections. Brandon felt his control slipping. Richardson was supposed to be a small-town pharmacist playing at politics, not a serious threat. But the old man was proving more formidable than expected. What do you recommend? He asked finally. Full damage control. We get ahead of the story, control the narrative. You make a public statement expressing concern for your wife's mental health during this difficult pregnancy. You suggest she's having some kind of breakdown, that you're seeking professional help for her. Make her look crazy. Make her look unstable, Walsh corrected. Pregnancy hormones, postpartum depression starting early, emotional volatility. We plant the idea that her accusations aren't reliable. Brandon considered this. It was elegant, actually, turning Melody's pregnancy into a weapon against her credibility. Pregnant women were emotional, everyone knew that. Hormones made them unpredictable, prone to exaggeration and false memories. Do it, he said. Walsh made notes on his legal pad. We'll also need to address Richardson. A sitting senator accusing you of domestic violence carries weight. We need to find something to discredit him. His business relationships, Brandon said immediately. Richardson's pharmacy gets most of its supplies through contracts with pharmaceutical companies. My pharmaceutical company. Economic pressure? Exactly. And his campaign contributors, several of them do business with Hartwell Pharmaceuticals. Make sure they understand what's at stake here. Walsh looked uncomfortable. Brandon threatening a sitting senator? I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply making sure everyone understands the economic realities of the situation. But Brandon's phone was already ringing with the first of what would be many difficult calls. His board of directors, his business partners, his political allies. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted assurance that this scandal wouldn't touch their own interests. Brandon, it's Tom Michaels from the hospital board, the first caller said. We're getting calls from reporters asking about your position here. What should we tell them? Tell them it's a private family matter that's been blown out of proportion. But if there are criminal charges, there won't be criminal charges, Brandon said firmly. My wife is having emotional problems due to her pregnancy. Once she gets proper medical attention, this will all be cleared up. But even as he made the calls, even as he activated his network of allies and influence, Brandon could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. The story was spreading faster than he could contain it, growing beyond his ability to control. And somewhere across town, in a small pharmacy surrounded by news vans, his wife was telling her truth to anyone who would listen. For the first time in his adult life, Brandon Hartwell was not the most powerful person in the room. The realization was terrifying. My niece was assaulted today, and I witnessed it personally. Senator Bill Richardson stood behind the podium in Millbrook's modest city hall, facing a crowd of reporters that had tripled in size since the morning. The room buzzed with nervous energy as cameras focused and notebooks open. Melody sat in the front row between Dr. Clearwater and Rebecca Martinez, the domestic violence counselor who'd arrived within an hour of being called. Her cheek still bore the red mark of Brandon's hand, though she'd refused makeup to cover it. I want to be absolutely clear about what I saw, Bill continued, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in public service. At approximately 2:30 this afternoon, I watched Brandon Hartwell strike his pregnant wife across the face with enough force to nearly knock her down. The room erupted with questions, but Bill raised his hand for silence. This isn't about politics. It's not about personal vendettas or publicity. It's about the fact that domestic violence affects 1 in 4 women in this country, and it doesn't become acceptable just because the perpetrator is wealthy or powerful. In the back of the room, Channel 7's reporter leaned forward. Senator Richardson, what's your response to suggestions that your niece might be experiencing pregnancy-related emotional instability? Bill's expression hardened. I'm going to pretend you didn't just suggest that a woman who's been medically documented as having multiple injuries from physical abuse is simply emotional because she's pregnant. But sir, sources close to the Hartwell family are engaging in classic victim blaming, Bill interrupted, and I won't dignify their attempts to gaslight a domestic violence victim by treating them as legitimate journalism. The reporter pressed on. Mr. Hartwell's attorney has indicated they'll be seeking medical evaluation of Mrs. Hartwell's mental state. Then they'll be disappointed when they discover she's completely lucid, entirely credible, and telling the truth about being systematically abused by her husband. Melody felt a surge of gratitude toward her uncle. For months, Brandon had convinced her that she was overreacting, that her perceptions couldn't be trusted, that she was too emotional to think clearly. Hearing someone she respected declare her credible in front of the entire state media felt like oxygen after months of suffocation. Senator, called out a reporter from the Tribune, what's your response to concerns that this will damage your political career? Bill looked directly into the cameras. If standing up for domestic violence victims damages my political career, then I'm proud to have that political career damaged. The statement would be replayed on news broadcasts across the state within the hour. Rebecca Martinez squeezed Melody's hand. At 38, she'd been counseling domestic violence survivors for a decade and recognized the signs of a woman taking her first steps toward freedom. How are you feeling? Rebecca whispered. Terrified, Melody admitted, but also lighter somehow. Like I've been holding my breath for 3 years and I'm finally exhaling. On the podium, Bill was fielding questions about domestic violence resources and legal protections. But Melody's attention was caught by movement at the back of the room. Brandon's mother, Grace Hartwell, pushing through the crowd of reporters with the determination of a woman on a mission. Grace was an elegant 62-year-old who'd spent 4 decades as the wife of a powerful businessman and knew how to command a room. She was impeccably dressed despite the short notice, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression carefully controlled. Senator Richardson, Grace called out, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. Might I have a word? The room went silent. Everyone recognized her. Grace Hartwell was a fixture on hospital boards and charity committees, a woman whose opinion carried weight in social circles throughout the state. Mrs. Hartwell, Bill said carefully, I don't think this is the appropriate venue. I think it's exactly the appropriate venue, Grace replied, moving toward the front of the room. Since you've chosen to make my family's private business a public spectacle. Melody felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Grace had always been polite but cold, treating her like an employee who'd been promoted beyond her qualifications. Now, with her son's reputation at stake, Melody suspected that politeness was about to disappear. My daughter-in-law is 8 months pregnant, Grace announced to the room. She's under enormous stress, dealing with hormonal changes that can affect judgment and perception. Any medical professional will tell you that pregnancy can cause emotional volatility, even hallucinations in extreme cases. Mrs. Hartwell, Dr. Clearwater stood up from her seat. I've examined your daughter-in-law thoroughly. Her injuries are real, documented, and consistent with physical abuse. Patricia, you've known our family for years, Grace said, switching to a more personal approach. You know Brandon isn't capable of violence. He's a devoted husband and father-to-be. Whatever Melody thinks happened, I don't think anything happened, Melody said quietly, finding her voice. I know what happened. Your son hit me. He's been hitting me for months. Grace turned to face her, and for a moment, Melody saw something flicker in the older woman's eyes. Not surprise, but something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Sweetheart, Grace said, her voice taking on a maternal tone. You're clearly overwhelmed. The pregnancy, the stress of Brandon's demanding career. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're under pressure. My mind isn't playing tricks, Melody replied. Your son is an abuser. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Grace's composure finally cracked slightly. How dare you, she said, her voice low and dangerous. How dare you sit there and destroy my son's reputation with lies and exaggerations? Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? The life he's provided for you? The future he's building for your child? The future where he teaches our daughter that it's normal for men to hit women? Melody asked. Brandon would never hurt a child. He hurts me, Melody said simply. I'm carrying his child. If he'll hit a pregnant woman, what makes you think he'll stop there? The question seemed to hit Grace like a physical blow. She stared at Melody for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. You don't understand, Grace said finally. Men like Brandon, men with power and responsibility, sometimes they need outlets for their stress. That doesn't mean they're monsters. The statement sent a chill through the room. Dr. Clearwater shook her head in disgust, and several reporters began writing furiously. Mrs. Hartwell, Bill said carefully, are you suggesting that domestic violence is an acceptable outlet for stress? Grace seemed to realize what she'd said, how it sounded. Of course not. I'm simply saying that marriage is complicated, that sometimes people misinterpret. There's no misinterpretation of a hand across the face, Rebecca Martinez said firmly. Grace looked around the room, realizing she was losing ground. This is a family matter that should be handled privately, with counseling and support, not public humiliation. Family matters become public matters when they involve criminal assault, Bill replied. Grace's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with visible irritation. Then her expression changed, becoming almost panicked. What is it? Someone called out. Grace looked up from her phone, her face pale. Brandon's been terminated by his board of directors, effective immediately. The room erupted with new questions, but Grace was already pushing toward the exit. Her composure finally shattered completely. As the crowd began to disperse, Rebecca Martinez helped Melody toward the side door, where Bill's car was waiting. What happens now? Melody asked. Now you go somewhere safe and rest, Rebecca said. Tomorrow we start building your new life. Will it get easier? Rebecca smiled sadly. Eventually, but first it gets harder, much harder. Are you prepared for that? Melody looked back at the city hall where reporters were still conducting interviews and cameras were still rolling. Her story was out there now, beyond Brandon's ability to control or contain. I don't have a choice anymore, she said, and I'm glad. As they drove away from the media circus, Melody felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to her mother's newfound determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new attempts by Brandon to regain control. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Melody Richardson Hartwell was sleeping somewhere her husband couldn't reach her. It was a start. If you lose this baby because of him, he'll never forgive himself. Or you. Grace Hartwell's words echoed in Melody's mind as another contraction gripped her abdomen at 2:30 in the morning. She was in Bill's guest bedroom, but the familiar pain had woken her from restless sleep. Uncle Bill, she called out, trying to keep the panic from her voice. He appeared in the doorway within seconds, still in his clothes from the press conference. He'd been too wired to sleep, spending the night fielding calls from reporters and political allies. What's wrong? He asked, immediately alert. I think another contraction hit, stronger this time. I think the baby's coming. Bill was already reaching for his phone. It's too early. You're only 34 weeks. Tell that to your great niece, Melody gasped, feeling wetness between her legs. Uncle Bill, I think my water just broke. The drive to Millbrook General Hospital took 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. Bill had called ahead, and Dr. Clearwater met them at the emergency entrance with a wheelchair and a team of nurses. "How far apart are the contractions?" Dr. Clearwater asked as they rushed through the corridors. 3 minutes, Melody panted. "Maybe less." "Blood pressure is elevated," one of the nurses reported. "Heart rate 140. Stress-induced preterm labor," Dr. Clearwater muttered, pushing the wheelchair faster. "Get Dr. Martinez from obstetrics down here immediately." They were barely settled in the labor and delivery room when Brandon arrived, somehow having gotten word despite the late hour. He burst through the door with the confidence of a man who'd never been denied access to anything he wanted. "Where is she? Where's my wife?" "Mr. Hartwell," Dr. Clearwater said firmly, "you need to leave. There's a restraining order." "That doesn't apply in medical emergencies," Brandon shot back. "I have parental rights. That's my child being born." Deputy Morrison appeared in the doorway behind Brandon, looking harassed. "He's technically correct about the medical emergency exception," he said reluctantly. "But any threatening behavior, and he's gone." Brandon immediately switched to concerned husband mode, approaching Melody's bedside with an expression of worry that might have fooled someone who hadn't seen his other faces. "Sweetheart, are you okay? I came as soon as I heard." "Stay away from me," Melody said through gritted teeth as another contraction hit. "Melody, please. You're having our baby. Whatever's happened between us, whatever misunderstandings—" "There's no misunderstanding," she said fiercely. "You hit me, and now our daughter is coming 6 weeks early because of the stress you've caused." The obstetric specialist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, entered with an ultrasound machine. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to check the baby's position and heart rate." As the doctor worked, the room filled with the rapid thump-thump-thump of a tiny heartbeat. The sound made everything real in a way that months of pregnancy hadn't quite managed. "Heartbeat is strong," Dr. Martinez reported. "Baby's head down. Good position for delivery. But at 34 weeks, we're looking at potential lung development issues." "What does that mean?" Brandon demanded. "It means your daughter will likely need time in the NICU," Dr. Martinez explained patiently. "Premature babies often have breathing difficulties, feeding problems. She'll need specialized care." "This is your fault," Brandon said suddenly, whirling on Bill, who'd been standing quietly by the window. "Your publicity stunt, dragging our private business into the media. You've endangered my child." "I endangered your child?" Bill's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're the one who's been beating her mother." "I never beat anyone," Brandon exploded, his mask slipping completely. "I'm tired of this narrative, this victimization fantasy." "Security," Dr. Clearwater called into her radio. "I need security in labor and delivery room 3 immediately." But Brandon wasn't finished. "Melody, you need to stop this nonsense right now. Tell them this has all been a misunderstanding. Think about our daughter's future." "I am thinking about her future," Melody said, her voice steady despite the pain. "I'm thinking about the kind of man I want her to grow up around." "I'm her father." "Then act like it," Melody shot back. "Stop trying to control everyone and everyone around you and focus on what your daughter needs." Hospital security arrived, 2 large men in uniform who positioned themselves on either side of Brandon. "Sir, you need to calm down or we'll have to remove you," one of them said. Brandon looked around the room, clearly calculating his options. For once in his adult life, his money and connections couldn't get him what he wanted. The hospital had policies about disruptive behavior, and domestic violence restraining orders carried weight even in medical settings. "Fine," he said finally, "but I want to be notified immediately when the baby is born. I want to be involved in all medical decisions." "That will depend on the circumstances," Dr. Martinez said diplomatically. As Brandon reluctantly left with the security guards, the atmosphere in the room noticeably relaxed. Melody's blood pressure began to drop, and the contractions became more manageable. "Better?" Dr. Clearwater asked gently. "Much," Melody admitted. "I didn't realize how tense I was until he left." "Stress absolutely affects labor and delivery," Dr. Martinez explained. "Your body was responding to a perceived threat." Over the next 4 hours, as dawn broke outside the hospital windows, Melody labored with the support of her uncle, Dr. Clearwater, and Rebecca Martinez, who'd arrived to provide emotional support during the birth. I can see her head, Dr. Martinez announced. One more push, Melody. Emma Grace Richardson Hartwell entered the world at 6:47 a.m., weighing 4 pounds 2 ounces, and immediately began crying with impressive lung power for such a tiny person. She's beautiful, Dr. Martinez said, quickly checking the baby's reflexes and breathing. But we need to get her to the NICU for monitoring. Melody got only a brief glimpse of her daughter, a red, wrinkled, impossibly small person with dark hair and Brandon's determined chin, before the neonatal team whisked her away to the specialized care unit. Is she going to be okay? Melody asked, suddenly exhausted. She's a fighter, Dr. Martinez said with a smile. 6 weeks early, but breathing on her own. Good muscle tone, strong cry. I've seen much worse outcomes from preterm deliveries. Bill squeezed his niece's hand. She's got Richardson's stubbornness. She'll be fine. But their moment of peace was interrupted by commotion in the hallway. Through the partially open door, they could see Brandon arguing with hospital administrators, his voice rising as he demanded access to the NICU. That's my daughter in there. I have rights. Sir, your wife has specifically requested that you not be given access to the baby, came the patient response from hospital security. She's not thinking clearly. She just gave birth. She's emotional. Mr. Hartwell. Dr. Martinez stepped into the hallway, her voice carrying professional authority. Your daughter is stable but premature. She needs a calm environment for optimal development. I cannot allow disruptive behavior in my NICU. I'm not being disruptive. I'm being a father. Fathers don't terrorize their children's mothers, Bill said, appearing beside Dr. Martinez. Brandon's face went red with fury. You sanctimonious old bastard. This is all your fault. My daughter wouldn't be fighting for her life if you hadn't. Your daughter is fighting because you created so much stress for her mother that she went into preterm labor, Dr. Martinez interrupted. And if you continue this behavior, I'll have you banned from this hospital entirely. The threat seemed to penetrate Brandon's rage. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, medical professionals, security guards, his former uncle-in-law, and realized he was completely outgunned. This isn't over, he said quietly. I'll get custody. I'll get my daughter away from all of you. We'll see about that, Bill replied. As Brandon finally left the hospital, Melody closed her eyes and tried to focus on the most important thing. Somewhere in this building, her daughter was breathing and growing and getting stronger. Everything else would have to wait. But as she drifted towards sleep, she could hear her uncle making phone calls in the hallway, his voice low but determined. The battle for Emma's future was just beginning. She's beautiful, but she's too small. We need to get her to the NICU immediately. Dr. Sarah Martinez's words echoed in Melody's mind as she was wheeled through the hospital corridors toward the neonatal intensive care unit 6 hours after giving birth. The brief glimpse she'd gotten of Emma Grace, a tiny, perfect face surrounded by medical equipment, had both thrilled and terrified her. The NICU was a maze of incubators, monitors, and quietly efficient nurses. Emma lay in an isolette that looked enormous compared to her 4-pound, 2-ounce frame, connected to wires that monitored her heart rate, breathing, and oxygen levels. She's doing remarkably well for 34 weeks, explained Jenny Walsh, the NICU nurse who'd been assigned to Emma's care. Breathing on her own, good reflexes, strong appetite, we're mainly monitoring for feeding issues and temperature regulation. Melody carefully inserted her hands through the isolette's porthole windows, gently stroking Emma's impossibly small fingers. The baby's eyes opened, dark blue, alert, and somehow already determined. Hello, sweetheart, Melody whispered. I'm your mama. Emma's tiny fist wrapped around Melody's finger with surprising strength. That's a good sign, Jenny said with a smile. Strong grip reflex indicates good neurological development. Senator Bill Richardson stood behind Melody, his weathered face soft with wonder. She's got the Richardson chin, he observed. Stubborn from birth. She'll need to be stubborn, Rebecca Martinez said quietly. She'd stayed at the hospital to provide support during the transition to the NICU. Her father's going to make things difficult. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Brandon appeared in the NICU doorway. He'd clearly gone home to shower and change, returning in an expensive suit with his lawyer David Walsh beside him. I demand to see my daughter, Brandon announced to the charge nurse. Sir, this is a restricted area. the nurse replied calmly. Only parents and immediate family are allowed, and only with proper approval. I am a parent, Brandon said impatiently. You're also the subject of a restraining order, Jenny Walsh pointed out, checking her patient chart. Mrs. Hartwell has specifically requested that you not have unsupervised access to the baby. Brandon's lawyer stepped forward. My client has parental rights that supersede any restraining order. Without formal custody arrangements, he has equal legal standing with his wife. Dr. Martinez appeared from another patient's room, clearly having been alerted to the situation. Mr. Hartwell, this is a medical facility, not a courtroom. Your daughter is premature and requires a calm, stable environment. I cannot allow anything that might disrupt her care. I'm not disrupting anything, Brandon said, though his voice was already rising. I just want to see my child. Under supervised conditions only, Dr. Martinez said firmly, and only if Mrs. Hartwell agrees. All eyes turned to Melody, who was still standing beside Emma's isolette. The baby seemed to sense the tension in the room, her tiny face scrunching with distress. Look at her, Melody said quietly. She can feel your anger. She's 6 weeks early and fighting for every breath, and you're turning her medical care into a power struggle. I'm trying to be a father, Brandon replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Then be one, Melody said. Put her needs before your ego. Visit her when I'm not here. Don't turn the NICU into a battlefield. It was a reasonable compromise, but Brandon's expression suggested he found reasonableness insulting. I shouldn't have to negotiate to see my own daughter, he said coldly. You shouldn't have to negotiate, Bill agreed. But you gave up the right to normal parental access when you started abusing her mother. Brandon whirled on him. I'm so tired of that accusation. Then stop giving us reasons to make it, Dr. Martinez interrupted. Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to ask you to leave now. Your daughter's heart rate is elevated, which indicates stress. In premature infants, stress can lead to serious complications. For a moment, Brandon looked like he might refuse. But the presence of hospital security in the hallway, combined with his lawyer's subtle head shake, seemed to convince him. I'll be back, he said to Melody, and I'll be filing for emergency custody. You can't keep me from my daughter forever. After he left, the NICU returned to its usual quiet efficiency. Emma's heart rate gradually returned to normal, and she settled back into peaceful sleep. Is he serious about custody? Melody asked Rebecca. He'll try, Rebecca admitted, but judges are generally reluctant to separate newborns from their mothers, especially when domestic violence is involved. And with Emma being premature, requiring specialized care that you're providing through breastfeeding, I can't breastfeed her yet, Melody interrupted. She's too small, too weak. But you can pump milk for her, Jenny explained. Breast milk is especially important for preemies. It helps with digestion, immune system development, brain growth. The next several days fell into a routine. Melody spent most of her time at the hospital, learning to care for Emma, pumping milk every 3 hours, slowly introducing skin-to-skin contact as the baby grew stronger. Uncle Bill brought meals and handled the continuing media attention, which had intensified after news of Emma's premature birth. Rebecca Martinez provided emotional support and helped Melody navigate the legal complexities of her situation. Brandon visited twice daily, morning and evening, always when Melody wasn't there, always with his lawyer present. The NICU staff reported that he seemed genuinely concerned about Emma's health, but he also asked probing questions about Melody's mental state, her fitness as a mother, her plans for the future. He's building a case, Rebecca warned, documenting everything he can use against you in custody proceedings. On Emma's 5th day of life, Dr. Martinez delivered encouraging news. She's gained 3 ounces, her breathing is stable, and she's taking more milk. If she continues improving at this rate, we might be able to discuss discharge in a week or 2. Where will we go? Melody asked. The question had been weighing on her mind for days. She couldn't return to the house she'd shared with Brandon, but she also couldn't impose on Uncle Bill indefinitely. We'll figure it out, Bill said firmly. There are safe houses, temporary housing programs for domestic violence survivors. But that afternoon brought a development that changed everything. David Walsh arrived at the NICU with official-looking papers. Mrs. Hartwell, he said formally, you're being served with emergency custody papers. My client is requesting immediate physical custody of Emma Grace Hartwell, pending a full hearing. Melody stared at the documents, the legal language swimming before her eyes. Emergency custody, unfit mother, history of mental instability. On what grounds? Rebecca demanded, appearing at Melody's shoulder. Mrs. Hartwell's documented emotional volatility, her public breakdown and false accusations against my client, her inability to provide stable housing for the child, Walsh rattled off. Furthermore, Mr. Hartwell can provide superior financial resources and medical care. Emma's mother is providing the medical care she needs, Dr. Martinez said sharply, having overheard the conversation. Separating a premature infant from her breastfeeding mother would be medically contraindicated. My client is prepared to provide formula feeding and private nursing care, Walsh replied smoothly. Over my dead body, Melody said quietly. The room went silent. Even tiny Emma seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, stirring restlessly in her isolette. Mr. Walsh, Dr. Martinez said carefully, I need to be very clear about something. Emma Richardson Hartwell is my patient. Any custody arrangements that compromise her medical care will be opposed by this hospital's legal team. The baby's name is Emma Hartwell, Walsh corrected, and my client's resources. The baby's name is whatever her mother says it is, Bill interrupted, until a court rules otherwise. Walsh gathered his papers with visible irritation. The hearing is scheduled for Monday morning. Mrs. Hartwell, I suggest you get yourself some legal representation. After he left, Melody sank into the chair beside Emma's isolette. Her daughter slept peacefully, unaware that her future was about to be decided by strangers in a courtroom. I can't lose her, Melody whispered. You won't, Rebecca said firmly. I know some excellent family law attorneys who specialize in domestic violence cases, and Dr. Martinez's testimony about Emma's medical needs will carry a lot of weight. But Brandon has money, influence, and you have the truth, Bill said simply. Don't underestimate the power of the truth. As evening fell over the NICU, Melody performed her nightly ritual of reading to Emma. Tonight, a story about a brave little girl who wasn't afraid of anything. Your daddy wants to take you away from me, she whispered to the sleeping baby. But I won't let that happen. I promise you, sweetheart. Whatever it takes, I won't let him hurt you the way he hurt me. Emma's tiny hand moved in her sleep, as if reaching for something just out of grasp. Monday morning would bring the fight of Melody's life, but tonight she was still Emma's mother, still the one person in the world who could provide exactly what her daughter needed most. It would have to be enough. The board has voted. You're out, Brandon. Security will escort you from the building. But Thomas Richardson, Bill's younger brother and Melody's father, delivered the news to Brandon Hartwell's face via speakerphone during an emergency session of the Hartwell Pharmaceuticals Board of Directors. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. A Richardson was firing a Hartwell from the company that bore his own name. Brandon stared at the conference room full of board members who'd been his allies for years, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally cold calculation. You can't be serious, he said quietly. This company has been in my family for 3 generations. And it's been profitable for 3 generations because we make good business decisions, replied Margaret Chen, the board's longest-serving independent director. Keeping a CEO who's the subject of domestic violence allegations and a media circus is not a good business decision. Those are false allegations from an unstable woman. Those are documented allegations with medical evidence and eyewitness testimony, Thomas interrupted. Brandon, I've known you since you were a child. Your grandfather was a good man who built this company on integrity. Your father expanded it through innovation. But you've turned it into your personal kingdom, and that ends now. The vote had been unanimous, 8-0, with Brandon recused from voting on his own termination. Even Grace Hartwell, who served on the board as a family representative, had voted against her own son. Mother? Brandon turned to Grace with genuine shock. You voted to destroy our family's legacy? Grace Hartwell looked older than her 62 years, her usually perfect composure cracked by days of media scrutiny and public scandal. I voted to save it, she said quietly. Your behavior has put everything at risk. The company, our reputation, our future. My behavior? I'm being railroaded by a conspiracy between my wife's family and... Your wife is in the hospital with a premature baby because you beat her, Margaret Chen said bluntly. Stop pretending this is about anything else. Brandon's lawyer, David Walsh, leaned forward. My client disputes those characterizations, and I should point out that Mr. Hartwell owns 43% of company stock. You can remove him as CEO, but you cannot remove his ownership stake. We're aware of that, Thomas replied, but we can ensure he has no operational control. Brandon, your office has been cleared out. Your access cards have been deactivated. You are no longer welcome in this building except as a minority shareholder for annual meetings. Security guards appeared in the doorway, not the familiar faces who'd worked for the Hartwell family for years, but professional corporate security who looked like they knew how to handle difficult situations. This isn't over, Brandon said, standing slowly. I'll sue every one of you for breach of fiduciary duty. You're welcome to try, Margaret Chen replied, but I think you'll find that protecting the company from a CEO embroiled in criminal domestic violence charges is exactly what fiduciary duty requires. As Brandon was escorted from the building, Thomas Richardson remained in the conference room, addressing the remaining board members. Margaret, I'm recommending you as interim CEO while we conduct a proper search, he said. The company needs stable leadership during this transition. What about Brandon's stock position? Asked another board member. 43% gives him significant influence even without operational control. We'll deal with that as it comes up, Thomas replied. For now, the priority is protecting our employees, our customers, and our reputation. Meanwhile, across town at the hospital, Melody was learning about Brandon's termination from Rebecca Martinez, who'd been monitoring the situation as part of her comprehensive support for domestic violence survivors. He's been fired? Melody asked, adjusting the breast pump that had become a constant companion over the past week. Emma was now 7 days old and slowly gaining weight, but she still required round-the-clock medical monitoring. Unanimously, Rebecca confirmed. Your father cast the deciding vote. My father was there? Rebecca nodded. He's been a board member for 5 years, representing the Richardson family's pharmaceutical interests. Apparently, he and your uncle have been quietly building opposition to Brandon for months. Melody felt a complex mix of emotions. Her relationship with her father had been strained since her marriage to Brandon. Thomas Richardson was a recovering alcoholic who'd struggled with his own demons, and Brandon had systematically isolated Melody from her family over the past 3 years. But knowing that he'd stood up for her when it mattered felt like a small healing in an old wound. What does this mean for the custody hearing? Melody asked. It helps, Rebecca admitted. Brandon's argument that he can provide superior financial stability just took a major hit. Unemployed men don't typically win custody battles against employed mothers, but their conversation was interrupted by commotion in the NICU hallway. Through the glass doors, they could see Brandon arguing with hospital security, his face red with fury. That's my daughter in there. I have every right to see her. Dr. Martinez appeared, her expression stern. Mr. Hartwell, you were specifically told that visits are by appointment only, during designated hours. I just lost my job because of lies spread by this family, Brandon snarled, gesturing toward the NICU. I'm not going to lose my daughter too. Sir, you're creating a disturbance in a medical facility, the security guard said firmly. I need you to calm down or leave the premises. I don't need to calm down. I need to see my child. Inside the NICU, Emma began to cry, a thin, distressed wail that immediately brought Jenny Walsh rushing to her esaulette. Her vitals are spiking, Jenny called out. Heart rate, respiration, blood pressure. Melody was at Emma's side instantly, her hands through the porthole windows, gently stroking the baby's impossibly small chest. Shh, sweetheart. Mama's here. She can hear him, Dr. Martinez said grimly, watching Emma's monitors. The stress is affecting her. In the hallway, Brandon's voice was rising. You people are keeping me from my daughter. This is parental alienation, and I'll sue every one of you. Mr. Hartwell, Dr. Martinez stepped into the hallway, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years in neonatal medicine. Your daughter is a 34-week preemie who weighs 4 pounds. Stress can cause apnea, feeding problems, developmental delays. If you continue this behavior, I will have you banned from this hospital entirely. You can't ban a father from seeing his child. I can and I will if your presence threatens my patient's health, Dr. Martinez replied coolly. Emma's well-being is my only concern here. Brandon looked past her into the NICU, where Melody was softly singing a lullaby to calm Emma. The baby's cries were subsiding, her vitals slowly returning to normal as her mother's voice soothed her. Something shifted in Brandon's expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of calculating recognition. He was seeing, perhaps for the first time, the bond between his wife and daughter that he'd been trying to break. "Fine," he said quietly. "I'll come back during visiting hours. But this isn't over. Monday morning, I'm getting custody of my daughter, and then we'll see who has parental rights." As he left, the NICU returned to its usual calm efficiency, but Emma remained fussy, her tiny body still processing the stress of the confrontation. "Is she going to be okay?" Melody asked anxiously. "Preemies are resilient," Jenny assured her, "but they're also incredibly sensitive to environmental stress. The calmer we can keep things, the better for her development." That evening, as Melody was preparing to leave the hospital for a few hours of rest at Uncle Bill's house, Rebecca Martinez approached with sobering news. "I've been in touch with the family law attorney who will be representing you Monday, Sarah Chen. She's Margaret Chen's daughter and specializes in domestic violence custody cases." "What did she say about our chances?" Rebecca hesitated. "Brandon's lost his job, which helps, but he still has significant assets, family money, connections, and his lawyer is very good at making abused women look unstable." "What do you mean?" "He'll argue that your false accusations show you're vindictive and willing to lie to hurt him, that your public breakdown demonstrates emotional instability, that your inability to provide stable housing makes you an unfit mother." Melody felt her heart sink. "And what do we argue?" "The truth," Rebecca said simply, "that you're a loving mother who's been systematically abused, that Emma is thriving in your care, that separating a breastfeeding mother from her premature infant would be medically harmful." "Will that be enough?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted, "but it's what we have." That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Melody found herself back at the hospital at 2 in the morning, sitting beside Emma's isolette in the quiet NICU. "Your daddy thinks he can take you away from me," she whispered to the sleeping baby. "He thinks his money and his lawyers can break us apart." Emma stirred in her sleep, one tiny hand reaching toward her mother's voice. "But he doesn't understand something," Melody continued. "I'm not the same woman who married him 3 years ago. I'm not the woman who stayed quiet while he hurt me. I'm your mother now, and that makes me stronger than he'll ever be." Jenny Walsh approached quietly. "Couldn't sleep?" "Too much to think about," Melody admitted. "She's doing well, you know," Jenny said, checking Emma's chart. "Gaining weight, breathing strongly. Whatever happens Monday, you've given her a good start." "What if I lose her?" Jenny was quiet for a moment. "I've been a NICU nurse for 12 years, she said finally. "I've seen a lot of custody battles involving sick babies, and I've learned that judges usually recognize what's best for the child, especially when medical professionals testify." "And what's best for Emma?" "Being with the parent who puts her needs first," Jenny said simply. "The parent who doesn't use her as a weapon in their personal battles." As dawn broke over the hospital, Melody made a decision. She would fight for her daughter with everything she had, not with Brandon's weapons, money, influence, manipulation, but with the truth. It would have to be enough, because Emma Grace Richardson Hartwell deserved better than to be raised by a man who thought violence was an acceptable way to solve problems. She deserved to grow up knowing that love meant safety, not control. Monday morning was coming, and Melody would be ready. "Sir, you're not allowed on this floor. I'm calling security." The NICU-charged nurse's voice was firm, but not panicked as Brandon Hartwell stepped off the elevator at 7 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes and looking like he hadn't slept. It was Monday, the day of the emergency custody hearing, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic over the weekend. "I need to see my daughter before court," Brandon said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and rage. "I need to make sure she's okay." "Mr. Hartwell, visiting hours don't start until 8, and you know you need supervision," the nurse replied, already reaching for her phone. But Brandon wasn't listening. He was looking past her toward Emma's isolette, where his tiny daughter lay sleeping under the warm lights, connected to monitors and feeding tubes. "Look at her," he said softly. "She's so small, so vulnerable. She needs her father to protect her." She needs you to follow hospital rules, came Dr. Martinez's voice from behind him. She'd been making early morning rounds and had heard the commotion. Mr. Hartwell, you're in violation of the supervised visitation agreement. Supervised visitation for my own child, Brandon laughed bitterly. Do you know what that does to a man? What it feels like to be treated like a criminal for wanting to see your daughter? I know what it feels like to watch that daughter's vital signs spike every time you raise your voice, Dr. Martinez replied evenly. Security arrived, two guards who'd become familiar with the situation over the past week. But instead of resisting, Brandon held up his hands in surrender. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said. I just want 5 minutes with Emma. 5 minutes to explain to her that Daddy's going to take care of everything. Emma is 10 days old, Dr. Martinez pointed out. She doesn't understand explanations. What she understands is stress, and your presence creates stress. My presence creates stress. But her mother's doesn't? Brandon's composure was cracking. Melody's the one who's unstable, who had a public breakdown, who can't even provide a stable home. Her mother, Dr. Martinez interrupted, is the reason Emma is gaining weight and developing normally. Breast milk, skin-to-skin contact, consistent caregiving, these are what premature babies need. I can provide those things. Can you breastfeed? Dr. Martinez asked bluntly. The question seemed to deflate some of Brandon's anger. He looked again at Emma, at the complex web of medical equipment that was keeping his daughter stable, and for a moment his expression softened. I just want to be a good father, he said quietly. Then start by putting Emma's needs ahead of your own, Dr. Martinez replied. Good fathers don't traumatize their children's mothers. They don't turn hospitals into battlegrounds. Brandon was escorted from the NICU without incident, but his appearance had rattled everyone. By the time Melody arrived at 8 for her morning visit, the staff was visibly tense. How is she? Melody asked immediately, seeing Emma's slightly elevated heart rate on the monitors. She's fine now, Jenny Walsh assured her, but her father's visit upset her routine. It took 20 minutes to get her settled again. Melody carefully lifted Emma from her isolette, something she'd only recently been allowed to do as the baby grew stronger. At 10 days old, Emma was up to 4 pounds, 8 ounces, breathing entirely on her own and taking most of her feeding by bottle. Hey, sweetheart, Melody whispered, settling into the rocking chair beside the isolette. Today's the big day. Today we find out if we get to stay together. Emma's dark eyes opened, focusing on her mother's face with increasing clarity. The pediatric ophthalmologist had confirmed that her vision was developing normally despite the premature birth. Mrs. Hartwell? A woman's voice interrupted the quiet moment. I'm Sarah Chen, your attorney. Sarah Chen was younger than Melody had expected, probably mid-30s with serious dark eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses and an air of competent authority. She carried a thick briefcase and wore a conservative navy suit that suggested she meant business. How are our chances? Melody asked directly. Better than they were a week ago, Sarah replied honestly. Your husband's termination from his job undermines his financial stability argument. Dr. Martinez's testimony about Emma's medical needs will carry significant weight, and we have character witnesses. Your uncle, Dr. Clearwater, several NICU nurses who can testify to your excellent caregiving. What about his arguments that I'm unstable? Sarah pulled out a thick folder. We've prepared counter evidence. Your employment history, character references, the restraining order documentation, medical records showing the extent of your injuries. Rebecca Martinez will testify about the psychological profile of domestic violence survivors. Will that be enough? Judge Eleanor Stone is presiding, Sarah said. She's fair, experienced with domestic violence cases, and has a reputation for prioritizing children's welfare over parents' rights. If anyone will see through your husband's manipulation, it's her. At 10:30, they left for the courthouse, leaving Emma in the capable hands of the NICU staff. Uncle Bill met them in the parking lot, along with Rebecca Martinez and Dr. Clearwater, who would be testifying on Melody's behalf. The courthouse was surrounded by media. The story of a wealthy CEO's domestic violence case had captured statewide attention, and the custody battle involving a premature infant had added another layer of public interest. Mrs. Hartwell, a reporter called out, how do you feel about today's proceedings? I feel confident that the judge will do what's best for my daughter, Melody replied, the words coming more easily than she'd expected. Inside the courtroom, Brandon sat with his legal team, David Walsh and two other attorneys from a prestigious family law firm. Grace Hartwell sat in the front row behind him, her expression carefully neutral. Judge Eleanor Stone was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back severely and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd been on the bench for 15 years and had seen every variation of family dysfunction. "This is an emergency custody hearing," she began, "regarding the minor child Emma Grace Richardson Hartwell, born August 15th, currently hospitalized in the NICU at Millbrook General. Mr. Walsh, your client is seeking emergency custody. Please state your grounds." David Walsh stood, every inch the confident litigator. "Your Honor, my client seeks custody to protect his daughter from an unstable mother who has made false accusations against him, who has no stable housing, and who has demonstrated concerning behavior, including a public breakdown and vindictive actions designed to destroy her husband's career and reputation." "And Mrs. Hartwell," Judge Stone turned to Sarah Chen, "you're opposing this petition?" "Absolutely, Your Honor. Mr. Hartwell has been documented as physically abusing Mrs. Hartwell, who is an exemplary mother providing essential care to a premature infant. Separating Emma from her mother would be medically contraindicated and emotionally harmful." "Let's hear the evidence," Judge Stone said. "Mr. Walsh, you may proceed." The next 2 hours were brutal. Walsh painted a picture of Melody as an unbalanced woman who had fabricated abuse allegations to gain advantage in what he characterized as a marital dispute. He brought up her father's history of alcoholism, her lack of independent employment, her sudden decision to turn against a husband who had provided her with luxury and security. "Your Honor," Walsh concluded, "my client can provide financial stability, excellent medical care, and a stable home environment. Mrs. Hartwell cannot even say where she'll be living next week." When Sarah Chen's turn came, she methodically dismantled Walsh's arguments. She presented Dr. Clearwater's medical documentation of Melody's injuries, Senator Richardson's eyewitness testimony, the hospital staff's observations of Brandon's disruptive behavior. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "this case isn't about financial resources or housing arrangements. It's about the welfare of a premature infant who needs her mother's care to thrive. Emma Richardson Hartwell is gaining weight, developing normally, and bonding with her mother. Mr. Hartwell's pattern of domestic violence and his recent erratic behavior make him unsuitable for custody of any child, much less a medically vulnerable premature infant." The most powerful moment came when Dr. Martinez testified about Emma's medical needs. "Premature infants require consistency, calm environments, and specialized care," she explained. "Mrs. Hartwell has been exemplary. She's here 16 hours a day. She's learned every aspect of Emma's care. She provides breast milk, which is crucial for premature infant development. Separating them would be medically harmful." "What about Mr. Hartwell's ability to care for the child?" Walsh asked on cross-examination. "Mr. Hartwell's presence consistently elevates Emma's stress indicators," Dr. Martinez replied bluntly. "Heart rate, blood pressure, breathing patterns, they all become irregular when he visits. Premature infants are extremely sensitive to environmental stress." Judge Stone listened to everything with an impassive expression, taking notes occasionally but giving no indication of her thinking. Finally, she called for a brief recess and retired to her chambers. Melody sat in the hallway with her supporters, trying not to think about the possibility of losing Emma. "Whatever happens," Uncle Bill said quietly, "we'll fight it. This isn't over, even if she rules against us." But when Judge Stone returned, her expression was stern and her decision was clear. "Having reviewed the evidence and testimony," she said, "I find that Mr. Hartwell has not met the burden of proof required for emergency custody modification. The current arrangement, with Emma in her mother's care, serves the child's best interests." Brandon shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." "Mr. Hartwell, sit down," Judge Stone said sharply. "Furthermore, I am extending the existing restraining order to include the minor child. Any contact between Mr. Hartwell and Emma will be supervised and scheduled through the court. You can't deny me access to my own daughter. I can and I will if your behavior continues to pose a threat to her welfare. This hearing is adjourned." As the courtroom cleared, Melody felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. Emma would stay with her, would continue receiving the care she needed, would be protected from Brandon's volatility. But Brandon's parting words hissed at her as he passed, reminded her that this victory was only the beginning. "This isn't over, Melody. I'll appeal. I'll fight this. I'll make sure you regret every lie you've told about me." "I know," she replied quietly, "but Emma's safe, and that's all that matters." Outside the courthouse, facing the media again, Melody felt different, stronger, like a woman who had fought for what mattered most and won. "What's next for you and Emma?" a reporter asked. "We're going home," Melody said simply. "We're starting our new life." It wasn't going to be easy. Brandon would appeal, would continue fighting, would use every resource at his disposal to try to regain control. But Emma Grace Richardson Hartwell was going home with her mother. And for now, that was enough. "Guilty on all counts, Mr. Hartwell. You'll serve 18 months and surrender all parental rights." Judge Eleanor Stone's words echoed through the packed courtroom 6 months later as Brandon Hartwell stood at the defendant's table, his expensive suit unable to disguise the defeat in his posture. The criminal trial for domestic violence had proceeded alongside the civil custody proceedings, building an overwhelming case against the former pharmaceutical CEO. Melody sat in the gallery holding 6-month-old Emma, who had grown into a healthy, alert baby with her mother's gentle eyes and her great-uncle's determined chin. The NICU days felt like another lifetime. Emma now weighed 15 pounds and was meeting all her developmental milestones. The jury had deliberated for only 90 minutes before returning with guilty verdicts on charges of domestic assault, criminal threatening, and violation of a protective order. The evidence had been overwhelming. Medical documentation, eyewitness testimony from Senator Richardson, hospital security footage of Brandon's increasingly erratic behavior, and testimony from 3 other women who had come forward with their own stories of abuse at Brandon's hands. "Your Honor," Brandon's attorney tried one final appeal, "my client requests leniency based on his history of community service. And, Mr. Walsh," Judge Stone interrupted, "your client systematically abused his pregnant wife, terrorized her family members who tried to help her, and used his wealth and position to try to escape accountability. The only reason he's not facing more serious charges is prosecutorial discretion." Behind Melody, Uncle Bill squeezed her shoulder. At 59, the senator looked older than his years. The past 6 months of media attention and legal battles had taken their toll, but his voice was steady as he whispered, "It's finally over." But Brandon wasn't finished. As the bailiff approached to escort him from the courtroom, he turned to look directly at Melody and Emma. "This won't hold," he said quietly. "I'll appeal. I'll get new lawyers. Mr. Hartwell," Judge Stone said sharply, "you are in contempt of court. Any further outbursts will result in additional charges." As Brandon was led away, Melody felt Emma stir in her arms. The baby looked around with curious eyes, taking in the crowded courtroom, the flashing cameras visible through the windows, the sense of momentous change in the air. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Melody whispered. "Ready to go home?" Home was a small apartment across town that Melody had been renting with money from a part-time job at Richardson Family Pharmacy. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, basic furniture, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people. But it was theirs. No one could take it away. No one could use it as leverage. No one could make them afraid to be there. Outside the courthouse, the media circus that had surrounded the case for months was reaching its final act. Reporters crowded around as Melody emerged with Emma, but the questions felt different now, less intrusive, more respectful. "Mrs. Richardson Hartwell, how do you feel about the verdict?" Melody paused on the courthouse steps, considering her words carefully. She dropped Hartwell from her name months ago, returning to her maiden name and giving Emma the hyphenated surname that honored both sides of her heritage while distancing them from Brandon's legacy. "I feel relieved," she said finally, "not because I wanted revenge against my ex-husband, but because this verdict sends a message that domestic violence has consequences, regardless of how wealthy or powerful the abuser might be." "What's next for you and Emma?" "We're going to focus on healing and building our new life," Melody replied. "I'm starting a support group for domestic violence survivors, and I've been asked to speak at conferences about recognizing the warning signs of abuse." It was true. Over the past months, as her story had gained national attention, Melody had discovered an unexpected calling as an advocate for other abuse survivors. She'd testified before the state legislature about the need for better protective services, had worked with Rebecca Martinez to develop new protocols for identifying domestic violence in medical settings, and had received hundreds of letters from women who said her courage had inspired them to seek help for their own situations. Any message for other women who might be in similar situations? Melody looked down at Emma, who was reaching for her mother's face with chubby fingers. The message is that you're not alone, she said. There are people who will believe you, who will help you, who will stand with you when you're ready to fight back. And your children deserve to grow up in homes where love means safety, not fear. As the crowd began to disperse, Rebecca Martinez approached with a warm smile. How does it feel to be completely free? Terrifying, Melody admitted with a laugh. For the first time in years, I get to make my own choices about everything. Where to live, what to do with my time, how to raise Emma. Sometimes I wake up in a panic thinking I've forgotten to ask Brandon's permission for something. That's normal, Rebecca assured her. Recovery from systematic control takes time, but you're doing beautifully. Dr. Clearwater joined them, looking pleased but tired. At 46, she'd become something of a celebrity herself for her role in documenting Melody's injuries and advocating for better domestic violence protocols in medical settings. Emma looks wonderful, she observed, gently examining the baby's bright eyes and healthy color. Hard to believe she was ever that tiny preemie fighting for every breath. She's a Richardson, Uncle Bill said proudly, approaching with Melody's father Thomas. The two brothers had grown closer over the months of supporting Melody through the legal proceedings, and Thomas had been sober for 8 months, the longest stretch in years. Dad, Melody said warmly, shifting Emma so her grandfather could see her better. Want to hold your granddaughter? Thomas took Emma with the careful reverence of a man who'd missed too much of his own daughter's childhood, but was determined not to miss his granddaughter's. Emma gurgled happily, grabbing at his shirt buttons. She's going to be a heartbreaker, he said softly. Strong like her mama. Strong like her whole family, Bill corrected. She's got Richardson's stubbornness and determination. Nothing will stop this little girl from becoming whatever she wants to be. As they walked toward the parking garage, Melody reflected on how much had changed in 6 months. Brandon was facing prison time and would emerge to find his business empire dismantled, his reputation destroyed, his access to Emma permanently severed. Grace Hartwell had quietly moved to Florida, telling reporters that she needed time to reassess her family's values. But the changes in Melody's own life were even more profound. She'd discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, had found her voice as an advocate and survivor, had built a network of supportive relationships that had nothing to do with wealth or social status. Melody, Rebecca said as they reached their cars, I have something to tell you. The State Domestic Violence Coalition wants to offer you a full-time position as a survivor advocate. It would involve traveling, speaking at conferences, training law enforcement and medical professionals. That sounds amazing, Melody said, then hesitated. But Emma would come with you, Rebecca smiled. They understand that you're a package deal, and the salary is enough to provide real financial independence. Financial independence. The phrase felt surreal. For 3 years, every dollar she'd spent had been monitored, every purchase questioned, every financial decision subject to Brandon's approval. The idea of earning her own money, making her own choices, building her own future, was both thrilling and intimidating. I'll think about it, she said. That evening, back in their small apartment, Melody gave Emma her bottle while watching the news coverage of the verdict. The story had made national headlines. Wealthy CEO convicted of domestic violence. Senator's niece wins justice. Abuse survivor becomes advocate. Look, Emma, she said softly, pointing at the television. That's us. That's our story. Emma was more interested in her bottle than current events, but she looked up at her mother with trusting eyes that seemed to say everything would be okay. You know what I realized today? Melody continued, settling into the rocking chair they'd bought secondhand but refinished together. I spent 3 years walking on eggshells, trying to predict your father's moods, trying to prevent his anger. And now I get to spend the rest of my life teaching you that you don't have to walk on eggshells for anyone. The apartment was quiet except for the soft sounds of Emma nursing and the distant hum of traffic. It wasn't the mansion she'd lived in as Brandon's wife, but it felt more like home than anywhere she'd been in years. The next morning brought a knock at the door, a delivery of flowers from Uncle Bill with a note that read, "For the strongest woman I know and the most beautiful great niece in the world." But the real surprise came in the afternoon, a phone call from a woman in Colorado who'd seen the news coverage. "Mrs. Richardson," the voice was hesitant, nervous. "My name is Linda. I saw you on the news and I think I might be in a situation like yours was. My husband, he doesn't hit me, but he controls everything, and I'm scared, and I don't know what to do." Melody looked at Emma, who was napping peacefully in her crib, and felt a sense of purpose settle over her like a warm blanket. "Linda," she said gently, "you called the right person. Let's talk." As she settled in to help another woman take her first steps toward freedom, Melody realized that Brandon's greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating her uncle's political connections or the legal system's willingness to hold powerful men accountable. His greatest miscalculation had been thinking that breaking her would make her weak. Instead, it had taught her exactly how strong she could be. And that strength, that hard-won knowledge of her own resilience, was the most valuable inheritance she could give to Emma, Grace Richardson Hartwell. 6 months later, a reporter would ask Melody if she ever regretted speaking out, if the price of justice had been worth paying. "The price of silence was much higher," she would reply, watching Emma take her first steps across their new apartment, a larger place they'd moved to after Melody's advocacy work began generating real income. "My daughter will grow up knowing that when someone hurts you, you don't have to stay quiet. You don't have to accept it. You can fight back, and you can win." Emma, now walking confidently between the coffee table and the couch, looked up at her mother with bright, fearless eyes. "Mama," she said clearly, one of her first words. "That's right, sweetheart," Melody replied, scooping her up for a hug. "I'm your mama, and I'm never going anywhere." Outside their window, Millbrook was waking up to a new day. The Richardson family pharmacy, where this story had begun, was visible from their apartment. Uncle Bill had offered to make Melody a full partner whenever she was ready to take on that responsibility. But for now, she was content to be exactly where she was, a survivor who had become an advocate, a victim who had found her voice, a woman who had chosen love over fear and was teaching her daughter to do the same. The phone rang again. Another woman who needed help, another survivor taking her first steps toward freedom. Melody Richardson answered, Emma babbling happily in her arms, ready to help another woman discover her own strength. The breaking of silence had become a symphony of healing, and it was only the beginning.